Atlanta, Georgia. Josher. Before it was the Hollywood of the South, before the trap houses and the global conglomerates, Atlanta was a city searching for its own heartbeat. In the early 90s, the geography of hip-hop was a binary world. New York owned the grit, the cold, concrete boom-bap of the East Coast. Los Angeles owned the glamour, the sun-drenched, G-funk lowriders of the West. Atlanta? Atlanta was just the South. To the industry elites, it was a flyover zone of hospitality and slow tempos. But inside the Greenbriar Mall, something was shifting in the atmospheric pressure. Greenbriar wasn't just a place to buy a pair of Reeboks. It was the town square of Black Atlanta. It was a cathedral of peacocking. It was where you went to be seen before you even knew who you were. On an ordinary, sweltering Saturday afternoon, a 19-year-old producer named Jermaine Dupri was standing near the food court. He was young, dangerously hungry, and looking for a spark that could light up his newly formed so-so-deaf vision. He saw the usual crowds of teenagers, but then his eyes locked onto a disruption in the pattern. Two kids, 11 years old, Chris Kelly and Chris Smith. They weren't performing. They weren't rapping for spare change. They were just leaning. But they leaned with a confidence that felt 40 years old. They had a from-the-cradle cool that stopped the mall traffic. They looked like they knew a secret that the rest of the world hadn't heard yet. Dupri didn't see two children. He saw a marketing miracle. He saw the young cool, a demographic that hip-hop had ignored in favor of the streets. He walked up to them, interrupting their day, and asked the question that would effectively end their childhoods. "What do y'all do?" The answer wasn't a rehearsed pitch. It wasn't, "We want to be stars." The answer, delivered with a shrug by Chris Smith, was, "We just cool like that." The investigation into the birth of Kris Kross reveals that Jermaine Dupri wasn't just a producer. He was a forensic architect of image. He brought these two Chris's into his basement studio and began an experiment in charisma. He realized that the world was becoming weary of the hardness of the drug war era. The world was looking for an escape hatch. The world wanted to jump, but there was a fundamental problem. Two 11-year-olds rapping in standard t-shirts and jeans looked like a local talent show act. They looked like kids playing grown-up. To become icons, they needed a visual hook, a rebellion that was safe enough for a suburban mother to tolerate, but weird enough for a project kid to die for. During a late-night rehearsal, the legend says they were frustrated with their look. In a moment of sheer adolescent boredom, they decided to flip the script, literally. They turned their jeans around. They turned their jerseys around. The backward logic was born. It was a masterstroke of branding because it was physically uncomfortable. It was a manifestation of being totally crossed out. It told the world that these boys weren't looking at the same future everyone else was. They were looking backward, into a childhood they were already starting to outrun at 80 miles per hour. When they walked out of the house for the first time with their pants on backward, they didn't get laughed at, they got stared at. And in the music business, a stare is worth more than a standing ovation. By 1991, Dupri had the demo. By early 1992, he had secured a deal with Rough House Records, a label known for its alternative hip-hop edge. They weren't sure what to do with kid rappers until they heard the beat for a track called Jump. It was a forensic masterpiece of sampling the Ohio Players meet a high-energy pulse. When Jermaine Dupri handed Chris Kelly, the Mac Daddy, the microphone for that opening line, the frequency changed. Don't try to compare us to another bad little fad. When that record dropped, it didn't just climb the charts. It detonated like a cultural pipe bomb. The investigation of the jump phenomenon shows that it hit a primal chord that bypassed the logic center of the brain and went straight to the nervous system. Within weeks, the video was in heavy rotation on MTV. For 8 straight weeks, Chris Kelly and Chris Smith were the most famous human beings in the music industry. They were 12 years old, and they had just conquered a planet that hadn't even finished teaching them how to drive. They were on the cover of Tiger Beat and the New York Times in the same week. They were selling Sprite. They were becoming the faces of a new Atlanta. But as the first episode of our investigation concludes, we have to look closely at the eyes of Chris Kelly in those early music videos. Beneath the backward jersey, Beneath the perfectly styled braids and the infectious smile, there is a certain stillness, a quietness. He was a boy who had been made into a prophet before he had ever been allowed to be a person. He had made the whole world jump, but as he sat in the back of a blacked-out limousine at 13 years old, he was starting to realize that the higher you jump, the further away the ground feels. And the ground was coming for him, sooner than anyone could have predicted. Imagine being 13 years old. Your biggest concern should be a math test or a girl in homeroom. But for Chris Kelly and Chris Smith, the normal world had been replaced by a private jet and a backstage pass to the greatest show on Earth. The investigation into the summer of 1992 reveals a surreal forensic anomaly. Kris Kross had become so big, so fast, that they were no longer being compared to other rappers. They were being recruited by royalty. Specifically, the king of pop. Michael Jackson was at the height of his dangerous era. He was looking for the pulse of the youth, and he found it in two kids from Atlanta wearing their pants backward. He didn't just invite them to open for him, he pulled them into his private orbit. Suddenly, Chris Kelly wasn't just Mac Daddy from the Greenbriar Mall, he was a guest at Neverland Ranch. The forensic psychological shift here is massive. When you are 13 and Michael Jackson tells you that you are a star, the gravity of the real world, the world of school, chores, and average childhood simply ceases to exist. You are no longer living in Atlanta. You are living in the orbit. The investigation into the Dangerous World Tour shows a grueling schedule that would have broken a veteran performer. They were traveling from Bucharest to London, performing in front of crowds that stretched to the horizon. But behind the curtain, the two Chris's were still just boys. There are stories of them playing hide-and-seek in five-star hotels or trying to find a McDonald's in a country where they didn't speak the language. But the cameras were always there. The investigation reveals that this was the moment the mask began to fuse with the face. Chris Kelly couldn't take off the backward jersey and go for a walk. He was a 4-hour-a-day product. He was the mascot for a generation's joy, even as his own childhood was being consumed by the tour bus. Then came the Jam video. If Jump was their arrival, Jam was their coronation. They were on screen with Michael Jackson, Michael Jordan, and Heavy D. In the forensic history of black excellence, this was the ultimate apex. But as we look at the footage today, we see a disturbing trend. Chris Kelly, the Mac Daddy, is often the one looking directly at the lens with a sense of duty. He wasn't just having fun, he was working. He was the one Jermaine Dupri leaned on to hold the rhythm, to keep the energy up, to be the harder edge of the duo. The investigation shows that while Chris Smith was the charismatic extrovert, Chris Kelly was the engine, the one who felt the pressure of the so-so-deaf legacy on his narrow shoulders. By the time they returned to the United States, they were multi-platinum. Their debut album, Totally Crossed Out, had sold 4 million copies. They were the faces of Sprite, video games, and Saturday morning cartoons. But the investigation into their return to Atlanta shows a jagged transition. They went back to school, but they weren't students. They were monuments. They had bodyguards in the hallways. They had teachers who didn't know whether to give them a grade or an autograph. The orbit had changed their DNA. They had seen the top of the mountain before they had even reached puberty. And as we close episode 2, we have to ask the forensic question, what happens to a boy who has already achieved everything by the age of 14? When you've shared a stage with Michael Jackson, what does the future even look like? The investigation shows that as they moved toward their second album, Da Bomb, the world was starting to change. The innocence of 1992 was fading. The air in the industry was getting colder, and the Mac Daddy was about to find out that in the music business, your biggest fan today is often the person who forgets your name tomorrow. By 1993, the global euphoria of Jump began to settle, and a cold forensic reality set in. The boys were growing up. Puberty is a natural process for a human, but for a brand built on childhood innocence, it is a terminal threat. The investigation into the transition between their debut and their sophomore effort, Da Bomb, reveals a culture that was no longer interested in cute. The sun-drenched pop rap of the early 90 seconds was being pushed aside by the heavy, dark clouds of gangsta rap coming from Death Row in the west and the Wu-Tang Clan in the east. To survive, Kris Kross had to do the one thing that is most dangerous for a child star. They had to harden. Jermaine Dupri, the architect, felt the shift in the wind. He knew that if Kris Kross stayed in the bubblegum lane, they would be discarded by the very streets that birthed them. The investigation into the recording of Da Bomb shows a deliberate effort to pivot. They lowered the tempos. They added dancehall influences. They started rapping about the realness of Atlanta. They were no longer the two first graders from the mall. They were teenagers trying to prove they belonged in the conversation with the heavyweights. But when you spend your formative years on a private jet with Michael Jackson, street credibility is a difficult currency to earn. This was the era of the in-between. Chris Kelly, the Mac Daddy, was 14, turning 15. His voice was dropping. His face was changing. The forensic psychological toll of this stage is profound. He was being asked to be a thug for the camera while he was still navigating the basic anxieties of adolescence. The investigation reveals that the industry began to treat them with a new kind of skepticism. Critics called them manufactured. The streets called them soft. Chris Kelly felt this more than anyone. He was the engine, remember? He felt the need to prove that he wasn't just a puppet in backward jeans. He started diving deeper into the technical side of the music, trying to understand the why behind the beats, as if he could engineer his way out of being a bad little fad. It was during this time that the first physical cracks began to show. In high-definition music videos and magazine shoots, fans noticed something. Chris Kelly's hair was patchy. Rumors, cruel and relentless, began to swirl through the school hallways and the tabloid press. People said he had cancer. People said he had AIDS. The investigation shows that this was actually alopecia areata, an autoimmune condition exacerbated by stress. Imagine being 15, one of the most famous teenagers on Earth, and losing your hair in front of a global audience. While other kids were worried about acne, Chris Kelly was wearing hats to hide a flaw that the world used as ammunition against him. The album Da Bomb went platinum, but in the music business, platinum after multi-platinum feels like a decline. The lead single, All Right, featuring the dancehall legend Supercat, was a hit, but it didn't cause a movement. It didn't make the world jump, it just made them nod. The investigation shows that the orbit was decaying. The industry was already looking for the next new thing, and they found it in artists like Da Brat, whom Kris Kross actually helped discover. They were becoming the veterans of the so-so deaf camp before they were old enough to vote. There is a specific, haunting frequency of silence that only former child stars truly understand. It isn't the simple absence of sound. It is the presence of an echo. It is the sound of a world that has moved on to the next bright thing, while you are left standing on a darkened stage, still hearing the ghost of 80,000 people screaming your name. By the late 1990 seconds, the jump fever hadn't just cooled, it had vanished from the airwaves. The backward jeans, once a symbol of a global revolution, had been folded into cardboard boxes or relegated to the back of a closet, becoming a punchline in Where Are They Now? Segments. The investigation into the decade following Kris Kross's final album, Young, Rich, and Dangerous, reveals a forensic collapse of identity. For Chris Kelly, the Mac Daddy wasn't just a clever stage name, it was the only skin he had ever been allowed to inhabit. When the world stopped calling him that name, he was left with a terrifying, hollow question. Who is Chris Kelly when the music stops? He did not simply sit in the shadows and mourn his fame. He attempted a tactical survival mission, a desperate effort to reinvent himself from the ground up. He enrolled in the Atlanta Institute of Music, trading the spotlight for the soundboard. He wanted to master the physics of the frequency, to become an engineer who controlled the architecture of the beat rather than a face that marketed it. He founded his own label, Sen Raud Records Crazy Cool Connections. He began mentoring young, local Atlanta artists, trying to provide the guidance he wished he had possessed as he navigated the predatory waters of the industry. He was attempting to build a new house on the same ground where his childhood had been consumed. But the streets of Atlanta were a different place now. The playful innocence of 1992 had been replaced by the grit and realism of the Dirty South era. As Outcast and Goody Mob rose to define the new Atlanta, Kris Kelly found himself a veteran of a war that people no longer wanted to talk about. This created a profound psychological mismatch, a forensic glitch in his reality. Every time Kris walked into a room, people were not seeing the 25-year-old producer with a degree in sound engineering. They were seeing the 13-year-old kid from the Sprite commercials. That kind of static is enough to break a man's spirit. It is the feeling of being a ghost in your own city. To quiet the internal noise, Kris began to turn to the only thing that offered a consistent, reliable escape: the chemical numbness. The investigation into his struggle with addiction is a jagged, painful trail through the underbelly of South Atlanta. It was not a sudden explosion of rebellion. It was a slow, granular erosion. In the music industry, drugs are often the uncredited producer on the track. They offer a false sense of peace when the phone stops ringing and the royalty checks begin to shrink. For Kris, it was a way to survive the crushing pressure of being a has-been before he was even old enough to rent a car. Those close to him describe an exhausting, invisible war. He would disappear into the shadows for weeks, only to reappear at his mother's house, sober, clear-eyed, and smiling, promising Donna that the cycle was finally broken. But the forensic chemistry of a speedball, the simultaneous injection of heroin and cocaine, reveals a heart being pulled in two violent, opposite directions. One chemical demands the peak, the other demands the valley. It is the physiological manifestation of a life caught between the extreme high of global fame and the crushing low of total anonymity. By the early 2010 seconds, Kris Kelly was a man living in the in-between. To the tourists and the nostalgic fans, he was a legend. To his neighbors, he was a quiet, struggling man who wore hats to hide his thinning hair and shades to hide the fatigue in his eyes. His most consistent anchor remained his mother, Donna Kelly Pratt. She was the only person who saw the boy before the braids, the boy who just wanted to listen to his mother's R&B records in the living room without the world watching. She watched as her son tried to navigate a world that had used up his youth and left him with nothing but a platinum plaque and a heavy, ringing silence. As we move into the final months of his life, we see a man hovering on the edge of a return. In the winter of 2013, the phone rings. It is Jermaine Dupri. There is an anniversary concert at the Fox Theater. The world wants to see the Mac Daddy jump one last time. For a brief moment, the chemical fog lifts. There is a spark of genuine hope, a chance to reconcile the man with the myth. But as our investigation will show, sometimes going back to the beginning is the most dangerous move a man can make. The light was finally returning to his life, but it wasn't the sun. It was the high beams of a destiny he could no longer outrun. In February 2013, the Fox Theater in Atlanta was transformed into a portal. The So Def 20th anniversary concert was more than a performance. It was a resurrection. When Kris Kelly and Chris Smith walked out onto that stage, the atmosphere didn't just change, it ignited. Thousands of people who had grown up with them, people who were now navigating the complexities of adulthood, mortgages, and parenthood, began to scream with a ferocity that hadn't been heard since 1992. Kris Kelly looked vibrant. He was sober, he was focused, and for 15 electric minutes, he was the Mac Daddy once more. He tasted the adrenaline. He felt the stage vibrate under his feet. For that brief window, the orbit was back, and the ground didn't exist. But in the forensics of addiction, that kind of peak is a high-risk trigger. The adrenaline of the stage is a natural stimulant that the brain, conditioned by years of struggle, often misinterprets as a call to return to the chemical rush. The investigation into the weeks following that concert reveals a man caught in the post-performance vacuum. When the applause died down and the neon lights of the Fox Theater were extinguished, the silence of his South Atlanta home felt 1,000 times louder than it had before the show. The contrast between being a god on stage and a man alone in a living room was a gap too wide for Kris to bridge. The investigation into the final 24 hours of Kris Kelly's life May 1, 2013 is a clinical study in the post-peak collapse. He had spent the evening at home with his mother, Donna. He wasn't at a celebrity party. He wasn't surrounded by the industry. He was in his sanctuary. But the forensic toxicology report would later tell a story of a silent chemical war occurring within his veins. He had ingested a speedball, the lethal combination of heroin and cocaine. To the outside observer, he seemed merely ill. He complained of nausea and dizziness, symptoms so mundane that his mother believed he was simply coming down with the flu. He went to lie down, seeking rest for a body that had been jumping for the world since it was 11 years old. By the time paramedics were called to the house at 4:30 p.m., the engine had already begun to seize. The medical reality was swift and cold. They found Kris unresponsive on his couch. They administered CPR. They attempted to shock his heart back into a rhythm, but the biological math was already set. A speedball creates a physiological tug-of-war. The cocaine demands the heart to accelerate, while the heroin demands it to stop. Under that impossible tension, the heart simply gives up. Kris Kelly was pronounced dead at the Atlanta Medical Center at 5 p.m. He was 34 years old. In the forensic history of child stars, 34 is a recurring, tragic milestone. Old enough to realize exactly what you have lost, but still too young to have found a way to live without it. The news of his death triggered a global forensic event of collective grief. The investigation into social media trends that evening shows a massive, unprecedented spike in 90 seconds nostalgia. People weren't just mourning a rapper, they were mourning the death of their own innocence. When Kris Kelly died, a specific version of the American childhood died with him. His funeral at Jackson Memorial Baptist Church was a study in broken brotherhood. Chris Smith, his partner in the orbit for over 2 decades, stood at the podium and delivered a eulogy that stripped away the platinum plaques. He spoke of the boy who used to share a bag of chips at the mall, the friend who walked through the fire of fame and never let go of the bond they forged as first graders. He spoke of the survivor's debt, the heavy weight of being the one left to carry the story alone. As we close the police file on May 1st, the official cause of death is listed as an accidental overdose. But as investigative storytellers, we know the cause of death is never just a chemical. It was the weight of a world that refused to let him grow up. It was an industry that celebrated his childhood but offered no map for his adulthood. It was the orbit that never truly allowed him to land. But as we move into our final resolution, we see that the jump didn't end on that couch. It lives on every time a speaker rattles with that heavy bass line, reminding us that even the most fragile stars can leave a resonance that the silence can never truly conquer. There are songs that fade the moment the radio is turned off, and then there are frequencies that etch themselves into the very DNA of a civilization. The investigation into the aftermath of Kris Kelly's death reveals a haunting forensic truth. He didn't just leave behind a platinum hit, he left behind a blueprint for the modern era of the American South. Before Atlanta became the undisputed capital of the global hip-hop world, before the trap beats of the 21st century conquered every chart from Seoul to London, there were 2 kids in backward jeans who proved that the South had a voice that could shake the planet. They were the first spark of a fire that is still burning in the skyline of Atlanta today. As we analyze the legacy of Kris Kross, we must examine the forensics of the child star. The music industry of the 1,990 seconds was an apex predatory machine. It often treated young human beings as disposable energy cells, powering a brand until the voltage dropped, then discarding the casing without a map for the future. Kris Kelly was the most visible casualty of this industrial cycle. His life is a clinical lesson in high-altitude trauma, the psychological cost of finding global fame before you've even found your own voice. But to remember him only as a tragedy is a forensic error. We must also remember him as a pioneer. He and Chris Smith were the ones who taught the world that hip-hop could be a place of pure, unadulterated joy. They gave a generation permission to be young, wild, and free at a time when the streets were becoming increasingly dark. The investigation into the backward logic reveals a deeper philosophical rebellion. Wearing your clothes backward wasn't just a gimmick, it was a refusal to follow the linear path that society had laid out for young black men in the inner city. It was a visual protest that said, "We will do this our way." Even today, 30 years later, you can see the echoes of that defiance. When you see a modern artist breaking the rules of the genre, you are seeing the spiritual descendants of the Mac Daddy. They are all jumping on the ground that Kris Kelly helped stabilize with his own life. In the final analysis of the Kris Kross Dossier, we find a story about the resilience of the human spirit. Despite the addiction, despite the identity mismatch, and despite the crushing weight of a memory he couldn't escape, Kris Kelly never stopped being an artist. He never stopped trying to find a new rhythm. He was a man who lived his entire life in the shadow of a 13-year-old version of himself, yet he still found the courage to step back onto that stage in 2013 and give the world one last moment of magic. That final performance at the Fox Theater wasn't a comeback. It was a closing argument. It was his way of saying that the music was always bigger than the man. As the lights dim on this 35-minute investigation, we return to the question asked in the Greenbriar Mall all those years ago. What do y'all do? And the answer remains the same. We just cool like that. But cool has a price, and Kris Kelly paid it in full. Tonight, somewhere in the world, a DJ will drop the needle on a record, a heavy bass line will kick in, and a crowd will start to move. They won't think about the toxicology reports or the silence of a South Atlanta living room. They will only think about the jump. They will feel the lightness, the air, and the brief, beautiful moment when the ground doesn't exist. Kris Kelly, the Mac Daddy, finally found a way to land. And in the heart of Atlanta, in the memory of every kid who ever turned their jeans around, the beat goes on. Unbroken, unfiltered, backward, eternal. This investigation cannot end at the cemetery gates. In the world of sonic frequency, physical death is not the final stop. It is simply a transition into what we call the eternal resonance. As we conclude this 35-minute journey into the life and death of Kris Kelly, we must analyze the final forensic category, the cultural debt. When we look at the skyline of modern Atlanta, we are looking at a city that was built on the momentum of a 13-year-old's leap of faith. The investigation reveals a striking truth. Kris Kelly was the icebreaker. Before he and Chris Smith stood on those global stages, the Southern voice was a whisper in the halls of the music industry. They were the ones who proved that the South wasn't a subculture, it was a superpower. Every major artist coming out of Georgia today, from the stadium fillers to the underground pioneers, is walking through a door that the Mac Daddy kicked open with his combat boots in 1992. His legacy isn't just a plaque on a wall, it is the very concrete of the city itself. But there is a more painful forensic layer to this final chapter, the survivor's burden. We must look at Chris Smith, the other half of the orbit. The investigation into the years following Kelly's death shows that Smith's silence was not an act of forgetting, but an act of preservation. In a digital age where every tragedy is converted into content for clicks, the dignity with which Smith has handled Kelly's memory is a forensic masterclass in brotherhood. He refused to let the industry exploit the tragedy. He chose to protect the boy he met in the first grade, proving that the bond they shared was the only thing the orbit couldn't destroy. As we close this dossier, the final image is not the darkness of a South Atlanta living room in May 2013. It is the image of a kid in 2025, stumbling upon an old music video, seeing two boys who looked like they owned the future, and feeling the sudden, uncontrollable urge to move. That is the forensic victory of Kris Kelly. He taught us that even if you only have one brief moment in the sun, if that moment is loud enough and true enough, it will keep the world warm forever. The jump never actually ends. It is simply waiting for a new pair of feet to catch the rhythm. The Mac Daddy dossier is now officially closed.